This is the Managing Microsoft Exchange Backups lesson. This is the 8th lesson in this course. In this lesson, you'll learn about the components and terminology used in Microsoft Exchange and the NetBackup agent for Microsoft Exchange. You'll learn how to configure NetBackup for Exchange, how to protect high availability Exchange environments, how to monitor and maintain Exchange backups, and Exchange disaster recovery considerations. This is the Introduction to Microsoft Exchange Server topic. Exchange is Microsoft's enterprise-scale email, calendaring, contact, and task management application. Exchange servers are generally accessed using clients such as Microsoft Outlook, but can also be accessed via mobile devices or web browsers. Exchange is an enterprise-scale application, often distributed across multiple hosts, which has different components performing different functions, and it's important to become familiar with them in order to optimize our backup strategy. The Exchange server is the physical host which hosts Exchange components. Exchange components consists of databases, such as the mailbox database, which stores the actual mailboxes with folks' email in them, and the public folder database. Note that different versions of Exchange may use slightly different terminology to describe the objects that we're talking about here. In Exchange 2010 and later, mailbox database and public folder database. In older versions of Exchange, we would call them a mailbox store and a public folder store. Also, Exchange 2007 and earlier had an object called a storage group, which was a grouping of mailbox stores and public folder stores. The concept of the storage group was removed in Exchange 2010 and later. Like a lot of enterprise applications, Microsoft Exchange uses transaction logs to provide for resilience and recovery from minor hiccups. And all incoming transactions are applied to the transaction logs first before they're applied to the Exchange databases. This slide shows a high-level view of Microsoft Exchange architecture. There are a number of roles that servers can have that contribute to the overall functionality of Exchange. Now, one Exchange server may be fulfilling one of these roles, or several roles may be combined onto a single host. Starting at the top, Active Directory is of course not really an Exchange component, but a Windows component. Active Directory handles network administration, authentication, and authorization for all users and hosts within a Windows domain, and Exchange is tightly integrated into Active Directory. The Mailbox Server role hosts mailbox and public folder databases. The Client Access Server, or CAS, hosts the web service and the client access protocols. In many ways, the CAS is the gateway to the Exchange environment, and it's a very important role for NetBackup. NetBackup will access the CAS server to locate Exchange resources. So, for example, if you're looking to back up or restore to a particular user's mailbox, NetBackup will access the CAS server to identify which Exchange server hosts the database with a current active copy of that user's mailbox. Other roles that we have here, the hub transport role is involved in the routing of email. The unified messaging server role allows users to access mailboxes, address books, and calendars using mobile devices. The edge transport server role is designed to be the outermost Exchange layer in a firewall, and so it offers some ability to quarantine mail and SMTP servers from the general internet. So as I say on the slide here, it would be the first hop for incoming mail and the last hop for outgoing mail. This slide shows Exchange architecture specific to Exchange 2013. There's some major architectural changes to Exchange server roles in 2013. Primarily, you'll notice there's a reduction in the number of roles. And so there's the mailbox server role, the client access server role, and the edge transport server role, and Exchange functionality has been consolidated into these roles. And of course, Exchange remains tightly integrated into Windows Active Directory services. This slide shows an example of the tight integration between Active Directory and Exchange. You can see how the Active Directory node can be expanded on the left-hand side and how it corresponds to the Exchange servers on the right. So in this example here, this administrative group has got 2 Exchange servers. Each Exchange server has got a storage group with a mailbox store and a public folder store. This is a 2007 Exchange version, so we still have the storage group objects. In 2010 and later, the storage groups no longer exist. Another change in 2010 and later is that all changes are recommended to be performed in Exchange, and then those changes are stored in Active Directory. Kind of reverse of the way we used to do things in older versions of Exchange, where we'd make changes in Active Directory itself, then those changes would propagate to Exchange. Here is some NetBackup specific terminology that's used when protecting Exchange. The Exchange agent supports GRT, Granular Recovery Technology, as many NetBackup agents do. This allows us to take a single pass backup of the Exchange information store. And as a result of that backup, we have the Exchange information store backed up. And for DR purposes, we could restore the full database if we need to. But we also have the ability to map its contents and enumerate through the individual mailboxes. So we could do mailbox level restores or even restores of individual items like an Outlook contact or a single email. When they say granular, they're not kidding. It's pretty granular. The NetBackup file system daemon NBFSD is used with GRT operations. It allows a NetBackup server to mount an Exchange database via NFS, and that's how it enumerates through the mailboxes and discovers all the granular items. Microsoft's Volume Shadow Copy Service, or VSS, is used during Exchange backups to take a consistent snapshot of Exchange, and then NetBackup backs up that snapshot. This is actually the same thing that happens by default for Windows file servers in NetBackup. A VSS snap is taken of the volume, and then NetBackup backs up the volume. It's particularly useful in Exchange because Exchange is a distributed application, and we want to make sure we're taking a consistent backup. The other 2 items on the table here, the Messaging API, MAPI, and the MAPI backups and restores. This is sort of the old way of doing things. When we wanted to have protection down to the mailbox level before we had GRT, you would use the MAPI interface to literally access each inbox individually and back up its contents. This was a process that was sometimes referred to as doing brick level backups, and the problem with MAPI was that it was slow. And these MAPI backups would be a totally separate set of backups you were doing apart from your regular backups for disaster recovery purposes. And so a lot of times, if we were doing this at all, we could usually only do it for a small subset of users. This is all older technology associated with older versions of Exchange and NetBackup. We really don't use MAPI and brick level backups anymore. For individual mailbox level protection, GRT is the way to go. In this lesson, we're going to provide the foundation for protecting Microsoft Exchange and doing Exchange recovery. NetBackup for Exchange is a robust agent which has more options than we really have time to discuss in the scope of this lesson. So for additional details about any of the Exchange functionality that we may have only touched on in this lesson, documentation is available in the form of this NetBackup for Microsoft Exchange Server Administrator's Guide. This is the Configuring NetBackup for Exchange topic. First off, before we start clicking buttons in NetBackup, we begin by planning our NetBackup for Exchange configuration, and we begin by checking compatibility. And we need to be checking operating system compatibility, NetBackup version, Exchange version, and we need to decide whether we're going to be doing GRT or not. Granular recovery has other compatibility requirements that are stricter than the normal agent. If we're going to be doing anything extra, like for example snapshots, using hardware instead of using built-in Windows VSS, then that's another compatibility list I'm going to want to check and make sure I meet the requirements for. Exchange is a licensed option if you're using the traditional licensing for NetBackup. If you're using platform licensing, it's included. We use the application and DB pack for protecting Exchange. This slide outlines the preliminary steps if you're going to be doing GRT backups with Exchange. First off, check compatibility. Make sure you have a GRT supported Exchange Server version and Windows version and NetBackup version. Make sure the media server platform type supports GRT. On your Exchange clients, make sure they have a drive letter available, because the mailbox database will be mounted via NFS on a drive letter in order for NetBackup to enumerate and discover the individual mailboxes. That also means that we're going to want to configure a client for NFS on our Exchange servers. More detail about that to follow. We're going to create a unique mailbox for NetBackup as a domain user. We're going to configure the NetBackup client service. And we're going to configure Exchange credentials in the client host properties so that NetBackup has access to Exchange. And then there are some other options there we may or may not want to adjust. The account that's going to be used there needs the rights to replace a process level token. And we're going to keep in mind some of the inherent limitations of GRT, which you may be familiar with if you've used it with other agents. GRT always requires the disk to be the initial target for backups. It's got to go to a disk storage unit. Can't go to tape or any other device that doesn't support random access. Now, if you wanted to do a backup to disk and then duplicate it later on to tape, that's fine. You can do that, and the GRT information will persist. It'll move along with it. Just keep in mind that restores for GRT, granular recovery, must come from a random access device. They got to come from a disk. So if you had a GRT backup on tape, you'd have to duplicate it back to disk in order to do a granular recovery. There are some limitations in terms of the specific version of Exchange and Windows that support GRT. Again, check the compatibility list carefully. And remember that GRT is only possible with full backups. So that means either full schedules or user-directed backups, because user-directed backups are also always full. Incremental backups cannot be used as the basis for a GRT restore. There is some ability to restore deleted items because deleted items tend to remain in Exchange databases for some time after the user hits the delete button. So if the question is, can we restore a deleted object or not, oftentimes we can. It just depends how long it's been since the user deleted it. We mentioned that one of the requirements for GRT is to configure NFS services for Windows. This slide shows an example of doing that for Windows 2012. A couple things to note here. NFS is a standard Windows service. It's one that's not normally installed by default. The name of this service and the exact steps to configure it tend to change slightly from version to version, so consult the steps that are specific to the version of Windows that you're running. Again, we're looking at 2012 here. We stop and disable a port mapper service if it's running. From the server manager, we say we want to add roles and features, and we drill down to select the server for NFS section, and we install the client for NFS. And, again, terminology here can throw us off a little bit. It is not required to have server for NFS on your client systems. It is only required to have the client for NFS. That might be an important point for security purposes. Some folks consider even the presence of an NFS server to be a possible security risk. We don't need it. We only need the client. And then if you want to, you can completely disable the server for NFS component. Here's a high-level overview of the steps to configure NetBackup for Exchange. We start by reviewing the information for configuring GRT, like we were talking about in previous slides. And if we're using GRT, we make sure to configure the NetBackup client service with a service account. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. We configure client and server privileges. Also more information to come about that. We configure the host properties for Exchange clients, and then we can create backup policies. Here's some more details about configuring the NetBackup client service. We're going to create an Exchange mailbox for NetBackup as a domain user. This is required for both GRT and MAPI backups. Now, GRT does not do the old MAPI style behavior of individually entering each mailbox to back it up. but it does still need to be able to enumerate and discover the mailboxes. And so it needs its own mailbox as part of that process. It must not be a hidden mailbox. And then I'm going to create a service account for NetBackup. And this service account needs to be a domain user with Exchange organization management rights. We used to be, old versions of the documentation used to say you needed to have domain administrator rights for this service account. That's not the case. Domain user and organization management is good enough. Now, if that's a problem, there's a procedure in the admin guide you can investigate to be even more restrictive about the permissions you're giving this service account, if you have to. There's more steps involved in doing it that way, but sometimes it makes the security team happy. And then I'm going to configure the NetBackup client service to log on using this service account. As we mentioned before, the NetBackup service account requires the right to replace a process level token. So here's an example of using the group policy editor to give the account that right. The account needs this right to be able to pass an impersonation token to the NetBackup process that performs Active Directory and PowerShell commands. If GRT operations are to be performed, we'll need to use the Exchange Management Shell to create a NetBackup role group and add the NetBackup Exchange service account to the NetBackup role group. The Client Properties has an Exchange Properties section where I can configure some options for Exchange. Note that some of these properties are specific to certain versions of Exchange and may not apply to other versions. In some cases, use of these fields may be mandatory. In particular, I'm looking down here at the Exchange credentials, which must be provided if you're doing GRT with Exchange 2013. This would be that service account that we created. NetBackup for Exchange is an example of an agent that's very tightly integrated with NetBackup, and the behavior is in many ways similar to file system backups. Exchange backup jobs, for example, can be kicked off one of three ways, the same way that file system backups, regular Windows policies can. They can be kicked off automatically by the NetBackup scheduler, and probably most Exchange jobs will be. They can be manually initiated by an authorized admin or operator on the NetBackup master server, or optionally I can create user backup schedules to allow users, in this case, the users probably are Exchange administrators, to invoke their own backups from the client. Here's an example of creating an Exchange policy. So the policy type is Microsoft Exchange Server. In this case, I have chosen to enable granular recovery. I just need to hit the checkbox on the policy, and of course to make sure that all the prerequisites have been satisfied. I'm going to check off Perform Snapshot Backups, which is going to be required in Exchange 2010 or later. It's always a snapshot backup, and usually we just use Windows VSS for that. And then you'll notice there are some Exchange server attributes that may be used if you're backing up clustered or replicated instances of Exchange. We'll have a little bit more detail about that later on when we talk about clustering. Here's an example of adding schedules to an Exchange policy. Looks like I'm going to have a full backup schedule and a differential backup. The example here is incomplete because we haven't configured start windows yet for these schedules, which of course we would want to. The schedules and Exchange policies are going to run either on a calendar or on a frequency, and they're going to have start windows just like any other NetBackup schedule. And the schedule types could be full, differential, cumulative, or user backups. Note that unlike some database agents, the use of user backups is not required, but it is an option if I want to grant my Microsoft Exchange admins that permission. The Clients tab is going to contain the names of the Exchange servers I'm protecting, or if I was backing up a database availability group, the virtual name of the DAG would be listed here. Note the considerations here on the slide that, of course, the NetBackup client software needs to be installed on all of the Exchange servers that are listed in the policy, and that if I'm planning on using GRT, the clients must meet the GRT requirements, and that for off-host backups, the client name listed should be the primary client's name. In the backup selections list of Exchange policies, I'm going to use Directives to instruct the policy to back up certain Exchange components. And the format of the directive will be a little bit different depending upon the version of Exchange that I'm protecting. So for example, the Microsoft Information Store will back up all the information stores on an Exchange server. Microsoft Exchange Database Availability Groups will back up all of the DAGs on an Exchange 2010 or later. The Exchange mailboxes and Exchange public folders is only used if you're using an old version of Exchange using the older MAPI style backups. For GRT backups, we would just back up the information store. And the NewStream directive, which is discussed a lot in the NetBackup Basic Administration class, can be used if you wish to generate multiple data streams. And it behaves the same way it does for file system backups. NewStream should be the first thing in the list, and then everything under that NewStream command is part of the first job. And then every time that backup sees NewStream in the list, it'll break off a new job. So if the NewStream directive appeared 3 times in the backup selections list, there'd be 3 jobs generated for each client in the policy. The examples listed in the slide here are all top-level Exchange objects. If you wanted to, you could append an individual object name to a directive to specify a particular database or a particular storage group for older versions of Exchange, or even a particular mailbox or public folder if you wanted to be really granular about it. You can also use wildcards to specify a group of these objects. Here's an example of adding backup selections to the Exchange policy. You'll notice that when you add backup selections, you first are prompted to specify the directive set that you wish to use, which may be specific to a particular version of Exchange. Make sure all of the directives you use are part of the same directive set. Don't mix and match. And then you can either type in your directive, or you can browse Exchange in order to locate the objects you're looking for. In most cases, probably safer to browse, so you don't have to worry about typos, messing up your backup. And then you see how you can use the interface to browse the directory structure of Exchange to locate the objects that you want to protect. And again, this might be a very high-level backup selections list, like Microsoft Information Store would essentially capture all of the Exchange information on a particular Exchange server, or I could be drilling down just to back up more specific objects. And like we mentioned on the previous slide, wildcards are supported. And so in the text bubble at the bottom there, you can see different examples of using wildcards to back up particular Exchange objects. NetBackup for Exchange supports the use of the exclude list if you don't want to back up particular objects. So if you want to, for example, back up the whole information store except for a particular database, or perhaps be even more specific and say, hey, there's just some specific mailboxes or specific public folders I don't want to protect, you can add them to the exclude list and they won't be backed up. When adding objects to the exclude list, make sure you specify them in Exchange directive format. And so to make sure you get this right, what might be easier to do is to go back to the Backup Selections tab and select the object you want to exclude using the Backup Selections interface, and then copy it onto your clipboard, cancel out of there, go to the client host properties, and then paste it into the exclude list. This slide summarizes some high-level recommendations for configuring your Exchange policies, and I think most of those things that we've mentioned already. The policy type must be Microsoft Exchange Server. We recommend the use of Granular recovery technology because it adds so much flexibility to your recovery. Performing snapshot backups is recommended for all Exchange backups and required for Exchange 2010 and later. And the schedule should be configured to satisfy the recovery point that you're on the hook to provide in your service level agreement. Certainly a weekly full and a daily incremental would be a reasonable suggestion, although you tailor that to your needs. You might need to do it a little more frequently than that to accomplish your objectives. And then when it comes to the backup selections, again, making the highest level selection possible guarantees complete coverage. And then if I needed to, I could always add a couple things to the exclude list if there was stuff I really didn't want to protect. And so in the case of a DAG in Exchange 2010 or 2013, back up the whole DAG. in the exchange of in the event of a standalone Exchange server backing up the information store, guarantees that I get everything. For MAPI backups, I can't really say these are recommended. They're really the older way of doing it, and they're very slow performing. So, I mean, our best practice really would be don't do MAPI backups, do GRT instead. But if you must do it, if you can't meet the requirements for GRT, for example, that is the correct syntax shown there. This is the Exchange and High Availability Environments topic. Because Exchange is a mission-critical enterprise app, it is desirable to make it as available as possible. Now, different versions of Exchange support different solutions for clustering and/or replication in order to improve the availability of Exchange. These are examples on this slide here using Exchange 2007, where we have clustering available using single copy clusters. And this is sort of the new name, at least new in 2007, for traditional Exchange clustering. The idea is that there are multiple mailbox servers which have access to a database that's on shared storage. Now, of course, only one node in the cluster can have access to this database at a time, but it does give me good protection against host failure. If I lose one of my mailbox servers, there are other servers around that can jump in. To provide for protection against storage failure, I can use replication. Local continuous replication, or LCR, uses log shipping of the transaction logs to maintain a replica, which is a passive copy of the information store located on separate storage, so that if the storage that has the active copy fails, I can fire up the passive copy and resume operations with a minimum of interruption. Note, though, that I have one mailbox server that has access to both of these copies, so LCR doesn't give me protection just by itself for host failure, just for storage failure. This slide continues our look at high availability in Exchange 2007, and we're looking to kind of step up our availability a notch here. In the first example, by using clustered continuous replication. CCR is a two-node cluster, and instead of using shared storage, as I was doing in SCC in the previous slide, I've got individual storage provisioned for two different mailbox servers. I've got one active mailbox server with an active copy of the mailboxes, and I've got a passive server with a passive copy. And that passive copy is a replica that's being kept up to date by using log shipping. So this gives me protection against both host failure and storage failure. And then if I wanted to take things even one step higher, standby continuous replication, SCR, introduced in Service Pack 1 to 2007, allows me to have a CCR cluster where I'm replicating data, again using log shipping, to a remote site. So that even if I lose the entire site and the mailboxes and information stores there, I can have a passive copy at a remote location. And we refer to this as a standby cluster because the standby mailbox server might or might not exist. Maybe it's always there, or maybe this is something I'm just going to create if I need it. This slide provides a more modern example of high availability in Exchange using database availability groups, or DAGs, which are available in Exchange 2010 or later. A DAG is a sophisticated cluster which allows for protection at the storage level, protection at the host level, replication, and also some degree of load balancing, where multiple mailbox servers have copies of the database, and a particular database can be active on different nodes at different times depending upon needs. And so the CAS server role, the client access server, is key when you work with DAGs. The CAS server is sort of like the front door to the DAG. When NetBackup needs to locate a particular object, say, hey, I need to find the active database that holds John Doe's mailbox. Where's that? NetBackup is going to talk to the CAS server. The CAS server knows where to find it, and it directs NetBackup to the appropriate Exchange server. NetBackup supports the protection of either Exchange standalone servers or Exchange clusters using any of the methods described previously. When we back up clustered Exchange instances, we can back up either the active or the passive node. Using the passive node might be desirable for performance reasons. It reduces the impact on the Exchange environment when the backup is happening. So the biggest differences here are in the Backup Selections tab. As we've discussed previously, we would specify the DAG object if we were backing up a DAG, and we would specify the virtual name of the group in the Clients tab. And in the first tab of the policy, the Attributes tab, you'll notice there are some Microsoft Exchange Server attributes here. And here's where we can decide, do we want to back up the active copy or do we want to back up the passive copy? And it also allows us to make a preferred server list. If this cluster has multiple nodes in it, is there one node that's preferable to use for the backup? And that can be a big deal, particularly when you're talking about replication scenarios, particularly when you're talking about a DAG, because you might have an availability group with Exchange servers in multiple physical locations. And you might want to ensure that backups are happening on a local node and not in some node that's located some distance away. Another setting to consider when working with clustered instances of Exchange is the Distributed Application Restore Mapping, which is located in the Master Server Host Properties. This is used with SharePoint and Exchange specifically. In Exchange, what it allows us to do is to create a mapping between the virtual name of the cluster or DAG and the physical names of the nodes within the cluster. And there's a couple examples where that might be useful. Primarily, it's in a restore scenario where you want to do a client-directed restore of data. Remember that the backup images will be associated with the virtual name of the DAG, whereas by default, my client only has permission to restore data that is tagged with its local host name, at least if I'm doing a client-requested restore. And so this allows me to make a mapping to associate all of the backup images for a particular DAG with the host names of the nodes in the cluster to facilitate these types of restores. It wouldn't really matter if you were doing a server-directed restore from the NetBackup master server, because in that case your permissions would be wide open anyway. But it would be a big deal if you were doing a client-directed restore. This is the Monitoring and Maintaining Exchange Database Backups topic. Here's an example of monitoring Exchange backup jobs from the Activity Monitor. When Exchange is protected, 2 jobs will be generated by default. A snapshot job that uses VSS to take a snapshot of Exchange, so it actually gets quiesced and then snapped. And then a backup job comes along and backs up that snapshot. And if you'll be doing GRT, then it also catalogs the granular items. Here's an example of the job details for a GRT-enabled snapshot job. So we can see the creation of the snapshot and the end of the snapshot from here. Here's an example of the job details from the actual backup job. And so you can see the normal entries here that you'd see for any backup job. You can also see Exchange-specific information here, like the starting of the granular backup processing and whether it was successful or not. This is the Exchange Disaster Recovery Considerations topic. This slide shows different types of restore operations that are supported for NetBackup for Exchange. The restores might be server-directed, coming from the NetBackup master server, or the request might be coming from the client, one of the client Exchange servers. We might be looking to redirect the restores to a different client or to a different location on the client. We might be restoring from snapshots if we're integrating Exchange with a snapshot client. With GRT, we might be restoring individual objects. Again, with a reminder here that GRT restores are only possible from disk and from full or user-directed backups. We also have the possibility again here that there might be snapshot backups that were created for instant recovery, and as those can be used for GRT. There's also the possibility of doing restores from single-pass backups of VMware virtual machines hosting virtualized Exchange servers. This slide describes the general procedure to recover an Exchange database. First, I'm going to make sure there's an Exchange server available Obviously, some kind of failure has happened here if I'm doing a restore, so I need to either repair my existing Exchange server or create another one as needed. Then I can use NetBackup to recover the Exchange database. And then optionally, I can extract mailbox or public folder data to the server. The idea here might be if you're in a disaster recovery scenario and you're looking to combine information from multiple Exchange servers onto one host, you might use that method. This slide describes the steps to recover the Exchange database. First, I'm going to create databases or storage groups that match the originals to be able to restore to. And I'm going to mount and dismount each store that I want to restore to. And this is going to create the data files that NetBackup needs in order for the restore to be successful. I make sure that the properties of this database are set to allow them to be overwritten by the restore. Install the NetBackup client software if necessary. And then using the bar console, go ahead and search for your backup images. Make sure your policy type is set to Microsoft Exchange and that the source client is set correctly. I restore the database and the transaction logs, and then once the restore is complete, I can reconnect the restored mailboxes to Active Directory user accounts. Here's an example of selecting Exchange databases for restore from the bar console. And what you see here is a little bit dependent upon the version of Exchange that you've backed up. So the first example, I've got a DAG backed up here from Exchange 2010 or later. Second example, here's a standalone Exchange server, again 2010 or later. Third example, here's an older 2007 Exchange server. And so really the big difference here is you see that in 2007 we still see the storage groups, whereas in later versions of Exchange you don't. When you go to restore the data, you'll notice that in the restore options there's an Exchange tab with Exchange specific options. First one is for replaying log files. What would you like to do? Would you like to do a roll forward recovery, or would you like to do a point in time recovery? And it kind of depends upon the kind of failure that you had. A roll forward recovery will roll forward all the logs that exist on the server, both the ones that I have just restored and any other logs it finds that are valid. And so this can be used to recover right up to the point of failure. A point-in-time recovery, on the other hand, only recovers up to the point of the last backup. So those logs that I'm restoring will be replayed, and any other logs will not be. So the point-in-time recovery might be useful if the reason why I'm doing the restore is because of corruption. If something bad got into the database, and of course we don't want to reintroduce it as part of our recovery. We basically want to roll things back to a particular point in time when we knew things were healthy. I'd use that second option for that. A couple other options over here, like whether you'd want the database dismounted prior to restore or not, and whether you want to commit or not after the last backup set is restored. Now you want to make sure that this option is selected only on the last restore for multi-job restores. Once this option is selected and the restore is run, no further backups can be restored against that Exchange database. This is sort of the similar to, in a database agent, the recover action that takes place after the restore action. Basically, Exchange is going to restore itself to a consistent state. It's going to do the replay of the log, and once it's done that, no further restores can be applied to it. Here's an example of doing a recovery where I have a GRT enabled, and I'm looking to restore an individual item. So you see with GRT enabled, you can drill all the way down inside the information store. In this example here, I'm inside one user's inbox, and I can see individual emails inside the inbox. So again, when we say that this recovery is granular, we're not kidding. You can go all the way down to a single email attachment or a single Outlook calendar appointment if you want to. Note that all of this indexing takes up a lot of space for GRT, and so when you open the bar console, it's only going to display the highest level objects, and then as you expand the tree and drill down to more granular objects, it'll do small little restore jobs to recover the indexes to support just the objects you're browsing. You wouldn't want all of these indexes available immediately because otherwise, it would take like 20 minutes for the bar console to open. And so NetBackup's idea is let's just give you what you need. And so it's not uncommon when you're browsing a tree to notice a slight delay. When you hit one of those little handles to expand the tree, there's a second or two pause before it opens up, and that's where the little restore runs in the background. We're coming from disk here, so the restore runs super quick. And then for granular restore, you'll notice a couple options over here, mostly about overwrite. If we're overwriting messages, is that okay or not? This slide discusses alternate client GRT restore requirements. There's some restore scenarios where the source client from the restore is different than the client that's going to be used to perform the backup processing. An off-host backup, would probably be the easiest example of that. Also can happen with clustered instances of Exchange. And so in that case, make sure that you meet all the requirements for granular recovery. In other words, the client and the server need to have the same version of Windows as the backup client, and the client needs to have services for NFS installed, and it needs to have an unassigned drive letter available to do an NFS mount of the information store. Here's some examples of some different Exchange recovery scenarios. Remember, if you're doing individual restores and you're going to be doing multiple restores, say for example you're going to be doing separate restores for a full backup and an incremental backup, make sure that you do not check off the commit after last backup set is restored option for your full and any intermediate incremental restores. That option should only be used for the very last restore that you do. You definitely want to use it. Just only use it for the last restore. Once that option is checked off and the database is restored, the log replay happens and no further restores can be applied against it. Other scenarios here, let's say I have a failure, some database corruption, and I've got valid server transaction logs still present on the Exchange server. So I could go ahead and use the roll forward recovery option so that those valid logs that are present are replayed. If the state of the logs is in question, if I'm not sure if they're good or not, then I might want to do only the full and incremental database restores and do a point-in-time recovery instead. So again, it depends upon whether or not the logs are there and how confident I am that the information in the logs is valid. If I'm talking about a storage failure, where I'm sure that there's no logs available on the server because it's all been wiped out, the whole volume was blown away. Well, in that case, then go ahead and do a point-in-time recovery and restore the full and any incremental databases. That would also be the case if I had some kind of a failure where I was concerned that the contents of the file system are corrupt. So I'm just saying, and I think there might or might not be some stuff there, but whatever's there, it isn't any good and I don't trust it. So point-in-time recovery, only do the roll forward on the data that I am currently restoring, the known good stuff. In this lesson, you learned about the attributes of the NetBackup for Microsoft Exchange Server Agent. You learned how to configure Exchange policies. You learned how to protect standalone and clustered instances of Exchange. You learned how to monitor and manage Exchange backups, and how to perform Exchange database recovery. This concludes Lesson 8.